Joining us right now is the chairman of the Republican Study Committee and North Carolina Congressman Mark Walker. Chairman Walker, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Maria.
So Devin Nunes just said that his committee is investigating this. What should be investigated?
Well, if you look, my first 2 years in Congress, it was an eye-opener for me serving on the Homeland Security, realizing how many times per day, tens of thousands of times per day, that China literally hacks every industry that we have. They are the biggest stealers of our intellectual property and have been doing it for decades. So the Trump body language and the movement to throw down some warning shots, I think is very important and sends a very clear message.
So you like what the president has done here then?
I do. Obviously, we want to make sure that the tariffs ultimately do not get to the place where there's an increase in consumer costs or ultimately even jobs. But I believe going after bad actors and communicating very clearly what the Chinese have been doing, specifically their leadership, I think it's a very educational moment for Americans.
Congressman, it's Dagan McDowell, though. If China retaliates, they've already started talking about tariffs on pork, but then what about hogs? That would hammer the very people in your state. And if they do retaliate, they will go after those states and those places who voted for President Trump.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. It doesn't just impact theirs. Even has ties to the EU. VF Corp, located here in Greensboro, very concerned. Even things about Wrangler jeans, a 25% hike across Europe. This ultimately, we know that free trade is very important. We have to be careful here. But sending a shot across the bow, I am glad to see that these what we thought was very wide scopes tariffs have been narrowing, and we want to make sure that doesn't unroll or disembark the good work from regulatory relief and the tax reform that we've seen already.
But I mean, do you think that $3 billion in tariffs that China has promised last week, was that just a gesture? I mean, obviously it's not commensurate with $60 billion in tariffs that the U.S. is talking about. It's $3 billion. So is China just saying we're not rolling over, but we're also not going to do anything to mess with this $375 billion surplus that we have?
I think at this point, Maria, that is correct. Maybe more a gesture than anything else. But ultimately, as most of your panelists would know, we certainly don't want to let it devolve into a trade war.
Right.
It's one of the reasons that this spending bill is so important that we make sure. I think Dagan hit it out of the park just a few minutes ago, breaking that down. It's very important that we keep our fiscal house in order as well.
Well, okay, you said that. That's what we're talking about all morning. But fiscal house in order, $1.3 trillion spending bill. I don't know. It doesn't add up, sir. You know, we've got brand new Fox News polls show this morning that Republicans are narrowing the gap with Democrats ahead of the 2018 midterm elections. Democrats have a 5-point lead over the GOP, but this comes as Republican Pennsylvania Congressman Ryan Costello confirmed yesterday that he will drop his bid for re-election and retire at the end of his term. So, Chairman Walker, are you worried that the Republicans are going to lose the majority in the House, and how does the spending bill play into that?
Well, I think that's secondary. I think ultimately what we need to be doing as members of Congress is fulfilling our promises and let the chips fall where they may. Do I believe that we have much to run off from 2017? We do. ANWR, regulatory relief, tax reform, pro-life legislation. But if Republicans get to the mindset that we can spend like the Democrats do and not do anything from here to November, I think that would be cataclysmic. I think it's very important to continue to build on those promises. The Republican Study Committee is coming back with a great fervor, pushing for a balanced budget amendment. We'll also develop our own Republican Study Committee budget that's going to be much more in tune and balancing, hopefully in 10, 11, at the most 12 years. It's very important that we communicate these principles to the American public if Republicans want to keep the majority.
Well, we want to talk about this because we all have problems with this spending bill, sir. I mean, the economy will obviously be a big issue in the midterms, and the president is tweeting about this morning. Here's what the president said just a few minutes ago. The economy is looking really good. It has been many years that we have seen these kind of numbers. The underlying strength of companies has perhaps never been better. Do you agree with that? And do you believe that if we keep running up all of these deficits, that that's going to cut into the growth?
I believe temporarily we are seeing some wonderful economic recovery news. However, if you look out just a few years, our mandatory spending has gone from about a third of our budget to closing in to 75–76% of our budget. We simply can't sustain that. In this specific omnibus, it increased non-discretionary spending or discretionary spending 13% in 1 year. As a fiscal conservative, some people like to say a fiscal hawk, sometimes we feel like we're the adults in the room trying to say or trying to put out some warning signs. We're the only group that doesn't have a special interest that we're advocating for. Were defense needs massive? They were. I've stood in the empty silos in Alaska where this previous administration depleted our military and defense. But at the same time, we have to understand that unless we're willing to go after these mandatory reforms, we will not leave the next generation very much to work with.
So, Congressman, you guys have the House, you have the Senate, you have the White House. And if you can't get this through now, when are you going to get it through? And how is it going to be different 8 months from now than it is right now? Because it seems to me that if you couldn't have gotten it done this time, how are you going to get it done?
That's a very fair question. I remember sitting in the room with the majority leader when Congressman Tom Graves came up with the idea almost a year ago that we would get all 12 appropriations bills done through the House for the first time in 13 years. We met that goal, sent it to the Senate. The Senate never took up a single appropriations. We then tried again in package 4 approps bills, budgetary bills, and put it in one particular piece of legislation. They still didn't take it up. So there's been some talk. Does the Senate eventually move to a 51 simple majority when it comes to any kind of budgeting idea or appropriations? I don't know the solution, but we're going to keep the pressure and keep the press on, really exposing those who are putting a stop in the progress.
And clearly there's some politicking going on with the pushback on President Trump signing the spending bill on Friday, because Secretary Mnuchin of the Treasury Department was on with Chris Wallace yesterday, and Chris Wallace had to remind him when he brought up the idea of a line item veto. He wanted Congress to pass a rule for a line item veto so the president could go through and veto line items in this spending bill. And Chris Wallace had to remind him, well, that was ruled some years ago unconstitutional.
It would be a constitutional amendment.
So again, it's, you could pass a constitutional amendment, but that requires a two-thirds vote in the House and the Senate.
It does,
Good luck with that
Dagan,
one.
but let's not just talk about the policy. Let's talk about the process of getting a nearly 2,300-page bill on the evening of the next day you're supposed to be voting for it. We have 8 full-time people, staffers on the Republican Study Committee. 2 stayed up all night trying to get through the bill. They weren't able to complete it. I think it's preposterous to ask us to vote on something so lengthy with the amount of pork and level that was in this specific piece of legislation.
But you did it.
No, I didn't. I was one of 90 that voted against it, and we're going to continue to rail against it.
Yeah. Well, this is an important point that you bring up. You voted against it, so you weren't one of those people who said, all right, look, I'm just going to throw in the towel here just to get the spending for the military. What are you supposed to do in the next time? The president said he's never spending something like this. He's never signing something like this again.
Well, this bill should have never reached the president's desk. It did not even have some of the specifics that he had asked for wall funding. I think we acquiesced a little bit too much. I've got to give the speaker a little bit of props here because I understood some of the talks and some of the battles that he was facing trying to get at least some of the things across the finish line. But this bill is really not good. You're talking about an increase of 13% in 1 year in discretionary funding. That's ridiculous. I believe it's very important that not just 90 of us, but more and more of members of Congress have to draw the line somewhere when it comes to being fiscally conscious.
Yeah.
This is preposterous that we would increase this kind of debt. We are now matching levels. Think about this. We are now matching levels, if not even more of a deficit than Obama's last 3, maybe 4 years in office.
Wow.
We've promised to do better, and I hope that more members will wake up to that cause.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thanks so much.